Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 21st of December. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Moscow. As you know, today there was a meeting. Around 1,500 officers and the Russian authorities were invited on that meeting, and during the day these guys were trying to understand, trying to underline the situation in Ukraine, trying to understand what did happen during the year and what the Russians are planning to do the next year. And they decided to change their entire military system. They decided to adopt a lot of things in the military sphere of Russian Federation, and the most I would like to discuss with you the most important one. The first thing is that the Russians are planning to increase the number of soldiers in the Russian army. And by the next year, the Russians are planning to increase the number of forces from 1 million to 1,500,000, so on 50%. And that's a lot. And the most important thing is that the Russians are planning to increase the professional part of this army, not the conscript, but the professional. And the Russians, as you know, on the 21st of February, when the Russians started the special operation, the number of Russian professional army was about 200,000 soldiers. And the next year, the Russians are planning to increase this number up to 700,000 soldiers. So more than 3 times. 350%, I believe, that the Russians are planning to increase the number of professional army in this 100.5 thousand million army. This is the first update. The second one, according to the local law in Russia, in Belarus, a person should join army as soon as the man reach the age of 18 years. If a person get, let's say, higher education, he gets some kind of during this period he shouldn't join the army, but as soon as he finish the college or receive higher education, after that he need to join the army. And the Russians decided to increase the age of man who should join the army, not from 18 years but from 21 years. And this is very important because, as we understand, the Russian professional army, Russian professional soldier pass some kind of its own path. He ends school at 18 years old. He joined army, and after 1 or 2 years of service in army, he signed a contract and he became a professional soldier. And the Russians decided to change this schema. They decided to add another 3 years between 18 and 21 years, and this is very important because during this period, these men are able to obtain some kind of specialty, to become doctors, to become, let's say, engineers or something like this. And as soon as they achieve some first step of their specialty, after that they will join army, and then they will make a decision to sign a contract or to live his own life as a civilian. So as you can see, the Russians try to increase and to develop the quality of Russian army, not just from school 18 years to become professional soldiers, but before becoming a professional soldier, you need to get or obtain some kind of specialty. You need to start some kind of work, to get your first job, to get your first experience, and only after that you will become a military officer, a military soldier, and then a professional soldier. So they decided to increase the quality of their forces as well. So this is two most important updates about the Russian military forces, about the things that they are planning to change the next year. And the thing is that the question how the Russians are planning to increase the number of their forces from 1 million to 1,500,000 in a year. And the only answer to this question is that they're planning to increase the terms of service from 1 year to 2 years. So in this case, those who will join the army, who joins the army, let's say in the beginning of the next year, they will forced to stay in army for 1 more year. Or they will be able to release from the army in 1 year later. So this is the reason how they can increase the army in this period. So this is very important updates and very important things that the Russians are planning to change in their army. So as you can see, the Russians prepares, and they still prepares to continue special operation. They prepare themselves not just for special operation, but maybe for more conflicts and bigger war than that might come on these lands during the next few years. Important updates are coming from Belarus. Today, during the day, we got report from the Belarus Ministry of Defense that they restricted access to the south part of Belarus, to this area, right exactly in the area that located on the north of Kiev, right exactly in the area where that the Russians used in February to start offensive operation in direction of Kiev. I'm talking about this territory. So if you remember, the Russians attacked Kiev from the north in direct from on the west part, and let's say through Chernigov in the east part of Kiev. So the same territory as the Belarusian forces restricted in the beginning of this year, they did the same thing today. So maybe some kind of signs that the Russians are planning to do something. Furthermore, right before I started publishing this video, we received another update on the border of Belarus. The Western sources and the Ukrainian sources are saying that PMC Wagner's sent around 200 soldiers to the border between Belarus and Ukraine with one purpose: to create some kind of provocation. So these guys will turn into the Ukrainian military uniform, and let's say these guys, according to the Western sources and the Ukrainian sources, will use some rockets or explosions, and they will make some kind of provocation that will force the military authorities of Belarus join the special operation. So this is the sign. We'll follow this situation as well. If you remember, these days, this week, on the 19th of December, there was a meeting between these two presidents, and maybe they signed something. Anyway, sooner or later, we're going to find out this situation. Now let's move to the front lines and discuss the situation on the ground. Today we have some updates as well. If we are talking about the front lines, very interesting updates we received from Kupyansk front line. From this area, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, there were clashes on the front line, and the Ukrainians lost around 60 soldiers and 5 armored vehicles. Furthermore, this morning we got update that the Russians tried to develop their bridgehead near Dvorechna in direction of Первый Liman. So, we have this update, at least an icon on the Western sources map, this like AK-47, that shows that the Russians were pushing and trying to attack the Ukrainians in the small village Masyutovka in this area. And the Russians reported that they were pretty successful, and that as a result of that attack, they forced the Ukrainians to step back from this position. And I believe that we will understand if it's true or not if the Russians will start some kind of offensive operation in direction of Первый Liman, Sinkovka, and after that, the next stop is Petropavlovka. And as you can see, Petropavlovka is already suburbs of Kupyansk, as you can see. And I believe that the Russians were forced to start this offensive operation because, as we know, there are very heavy clashes right along this road near Novoselovska, near Kotляровка, Kislovka, Novoselovska, and of course we understand that Ukrainians send their forces and they use this road N26 as the main supply and support road of Ukrainian forces who is fighting on the front line. And the Ukrainians are not planning to reduce the pressure on the Kupyansk, on Svatova, and so on. So this is the reason I believe that why the Russians start activated on the north, and they just want to force the Ukrainians to change the focus and to reduce their supply and support capabilities over near Svatova, near this line. Of course, anyway, the Ukrainians, if the Russians started any activity on the north of Kupyansk, the Ukrainians will be forced to move some reserves in this direction just to stop the Russians. So anyway, they will do this. Furthermore, if the Russians are able to achieve some success, the Ukrainians will be forced to stop completely operation in direction of Svatova just to stop the Russian progress on the north of Kupyansk. And if we're talking about the Russians, we need to understand that to take control over Kupyansk is a vital question for the Russians from many perspectives. That they need to return control over these territories, and the main reason is the railroad. Of course, it's logistic center, and there is a railroad that moves to the territory of Russian Federation. And if we're talking about Svatova, Krasnorechensk, Kremenная, Rubezhnoye, Severodonetsk agglomeration, Lysychansk, this is the only road that the Russians are able to use to supply and support this town from the mainland. Of course, there are a lot of local roads, but we understand that local roads don't have such possibilities as railroad. Anyway, it's furthermore, if we're talking about the local roads, the Ukrainians are able to send commandos, scouts that are able to reduce and destroy the convoys and so on. But if we're talking about the railroad, it will be much more difficult for the Ukrainians to stop the trains or something like this. So anyway, I believe that maybe these days we became witnesses of some kind of offensive operation near Kupyansk, and is the main target of the Russians in this area, to return control over this railroad and to reduce the Ukrainian pressure in direction of Svatova. Interesting updates are coming from Bakhmut front line, from Liman Bakhmut front line. If we're talking about Liman, the Ukrainians lost around 30 soldiers and around 6 armored vehicles. There are very heavy clashes around Liman. The Ukrainians tried to attack in direction Chervona Popovka. The Ukrainians tried to use this forest between Serebryanka and Kremenaya as some kind of bridgehead where they're sending their commanders and scouts. But all these attacks were repulsed, at least till today. We'll see what is going to be tomorrow and the next day as well. Now we are moving to Bakhmut. Today, almost every single Russian source reported that it was a fake update, fake news, fake piece of news that Zelensky entered Bakhmut. The Russians are saying that they analyzed the video, they analyzed the sound and so on, and they make a conclusion that it was a fake, and the main goal of that fake was to change the Russian focus. And meanwhile, Zelensky left Ukraine, and as you know, Zelensky is going to visit United States of America, and maybe by the time you're watching this video, this meeting will be finished or something like this. So the Russians are saying that Zelensky wasn't in Bakhmut. So we'll see. We'll see anyway. Sooner or later, we are going to receive more updates. Interesting information are coming from Yakovlivka, Solidar. This evening, the Russians reported that they managed to develop their bridgehead near Yakovlivka and near Solidar, and they managed to develop their bridgehead in direction of, let's say, the railroad. So, and they're saying not just that they got another 100 square meters. The Russians are saying that they managed to cross a lot. So for now, this map is not updated. Maybe just the gray zone have been updated and it have been moved closer to Solidar, but I believe that these days, if it's true, we're going to see more updates, and maybe a bigger part of Solidar will become under Russian control. Who knows? Today, during the day, we got very interesting updates from the Ukrainian side, at least from the Ukrainian sources. The Ukrainians reported that as a result of very heavy clashes on the east side of Bakhmut, they managed to return control over this block. So they forced Wagners to retreat. If we're talking about the Russians, they haven't proved this information, or they haven't discussed this information at all. So nobody talks, and furthermore, if we're talking about the Ukrainians, it was like maybe 1 or 2 updates about the situation, and later there were no updates about the situation at all. So maybe it was a fake as well. But anyway, during the day there was something like this and nothing more. If we're talking about Donetsk, the Russians reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Ukraine lost around 80 soldiers and something around 8 armored vehicles. The Ukrainians are not planning to give up. At least for today, they're not planning to step back, and there are very heavy clashes in Klishchiivka. As you can see, the Russian sources map has been updated. They moved the gray line as close as possible to Klishchiivka, and according to the Russian sources, as we discussed, the Russians managed to enter Klishchiivka from the south and from the north. And if we're talking about today, there were no updates. Maybe they were forced to step back, or maybe they managed to develop. Anyway, no updates, and I believe that we need to wait another 2 or 3 days to understand the real picture in Klishchiivka. If we are talking about Donetsk area, South Donetsk front line, during the heavy clashes, the Ukraine lost around 50 soldiers and something around 6 armored vehicles. There were no updates from Opytne Peski. This front line has been stabilized. Maybe there are very heavy clashes. Maybe the Russians storm Vadiana. Maybe they push in Peromaiska. Maybe they try to attack Nivolska, but we haven't received any updates about the progress. Maybe they decided to make a small pause. Even today, we haven't received any updates from Marinka. So the situation, I believe that there are clashes, but without progress for both parties. Maybe during the day we will receive more updates about this. Who knows? So this is about the situation on the ground. Very interesting updates are coming from the Russian military experts and from Kharkiv. During the day today, we got a lot of updates from the Russian sources, from the mainly from the Russian sources, that Ukrainians managed to accumulate a lot of forces near Kharkiv. Not just the forces that the Ukrainians are planning to use in offensive operation in Kupyansk. It's completely different group. They have their own commandings, their own plans and so on. The Ukrainians managed to accumulate another feast, and the number of forces, around 20,000 soldiers and something around 700 armored vehicles that Ukrainians managed to accumulate near Kharkiv. And these days the Ukrainians are not planning to use them. They're keeping them as some kind of plan B. And the purpose why the Ukrainians are planning to use this plan B, if the Russians will try to attack in direction of Kiev, as we discussed at the beginning of this video. So the Russians are saying that the Ukrainians keep the forces in Kharkiv with one purpose. If the Russians decide to attack Kiev or to cross the border with Ukraine on the north, on this area in Chernigov or Sumy region, the Ukrainians will start offensive operation on the territory of Russian Federation. Before today, we saw just the clashes and the battles around the territory of Ukraine. We haven't seen nothing on the territory of Russian Federation. There were a few cases about some commandos who were sent on the territory of Russian Federation, and they achieved some success by attacking some convoys, some small patrols and something like this. But today the Russians talks very seriously that the Ukrainians prepared the feast, and if the Russians attack somewhere else but not on the front line, on the usual front line, the Ukrainians will attack Belgorod region. And the main goal of the Ukrainians to take control over some towns on the territory of Russian Federation, really to capture, to establish their flag, let's say to create, let's say, Belgorod People's Republic or something like this, to do the same scenario as the Russians did on the south of Ukraine. And of course, if we analyze this Belgorod region, I don't think that Ukrainians with 20,000 army will attack Belgorod, because of course they're able to do anything, because nobody knows about the situation in Belgorod, about the military situation in Belgorod. Maybe the Russians are not prepared. Maybe they just prepared some kind of trenches along the border, but there are no even forces who are able to hold this position. Nobody knows, because it's a secret, right? But anyway, if the Russians prepared Belgorod, if there are forces to stop the Ukrainians, of course, if the Ukrainians attacks in this case, it will be like a suicide operation without no target, without no aims, and just with one purpose, to lose your own army. But there is one way to attack in direction of Belgorod, and I'm talking about towns by the name of Urazovo and Voluyki. These two towns. From one side, the Ukrainians will cross the border and will attack the territories and the towns of the territory of Russian Federation. It will be a significant media victory, and by this attack the Ukrainians, at least the Western countries, will understand, and they will test the Russians what the Russians are going to do in case if the war crossed the border and starts on the territory of Russian Federation. What the Russians are going to do when the Ukrainians enter Voluyki and started, let's say, killing civilians as a result of any clashes all over the front line. It's not even like a goal to kill civilians, but it will be a part of this operation. It's obviously, it's not like visiting shop or kindergarten. It's attack on the territory of Russian Federation and taking control over a small town or something like this. So if from one side it's like media victory, but from another side, the Ukrainians will be able to establish control over this logistics center, Voluyki Urazovo. And if we take a look about this town, we see that there are two railroads moves from this area. The first one moves to Kupyansk, and we discussed this railroad like a few minutes ago, and the second one moves exactly to Starobelsk. So of course it would be a very nice victory if the Ukrainians are able to cut this supply road. In this case, Starobelsk will be cut at least from the mainland with a railroad connection, because if we're talking about Lugansk, there are no strict connection with Starobelsk. So the Russians are able to bring some vehicles, supply to Lugansk, but from Lugansk they can use just like trucks and convoys and regular cars to support Starobelsk with products, with ammo, shells, and so on. But the Russians uses this railroad because this road is not cut by the Ukrainians. So this is possible attack in case if the Russians decide to attack the Ukrainians from the north. And these days we have a lot of talks about this situation, because there are a lot of updates from the territory of Belarus. There is like updates about these Wagner groups. There is like update about restrictions in this area, as we saw the same restrictions at the beginning of this year, and many other things. And today I try to analyze situation near Kiev one more time and the possible Russian movements, and I try to analyze the entire Ukraine, because one of the Ukrainian military experts, an expert general, reported that the Russians have forces on the territory of Belarus, but they're they are not able to achieve strategic goals. Like, these forces are not able to take control over entire western part of Ukraine. These forces are not able to take control over Kiev. These forces are able to do just one thing, and not very big thing, something tactical. And this tactical thing need to bring success, because anyway, if the Russians and Belarusians start offensive operation, they will have losses. So that's why the value that these forces are able to bring should be better, bigger than the losses they will achieve during this operation, possible operation. And I try to analyze what the Belarusians and the Russians are need to do to achieve as much as possible success in this part of Ukraine. During the previous videos, we discussed about attacking let's say, from the territory of Belarus to cut this supply road and this supply road. Of course, this is very nice operations to cut railroad between Poland and, let's say, north part of Ukraine. But this attack won't solve the entire problem of supplying and supporting of Ukraine. Anyway, there are still a lot of railroads on the south that Ukrainians will be able to use to continue this war. So in this case, the Belarusians and the Russians will be able to achieve something, but it's not, the value of these achievements is not so big as they need to achieve. Another option, of course, to get as close as possible to Kiev, let's say to encircle Kiev from the north, from the west, and let's say to start shelling Kiev as the same way as the Ukrainians shelled Donetsk, and with this to force the Ukrainians to start negotiation. Is this an option? Yes, this is an option, but there is a lot of if. So, what if the Ukrainians are? What if this situation won't break the Ukrainians and they will continue fighting? Because the same, from one side, the Russians will be able to attack Kiev, but from another side, it's not like even a very nice thing to attack the civilians. So the Russians, since the beginning of the special operation, try to show themselves completely different from Ukrainians. They try to show themselves as if they are following international law according to the prisoners of war. They're not attacking towns or something like this. So this is also not an option. So I try to understand what the Russians are able to do. To take control over Chernigov, Sumy, these regions doesn't have any industrial value for the Russians. They don't have value. There is no industrial zone. There is no plants. There is no mines. There are nothing there. Just the people you need to feed. You need to bring them water. You need to pay them salaries. You need to support them. And furthermore, anyway, you're going to receive some resistance there, as we saw in Kherson, as we see right now in Zaporozhye. So this is not an option as well. Just to show that you can, but it's not the Russian tactic to show that you can. These days they try to reduce such things as we show because we can. They left Kherson because then yes, they could hold Kherson, and but because they can, but they didn't do this because there is no value from this. The Russians left Kharkiv not because of the fact that Ukrainians were so successful. The Russians could hold Kharkiv, but they decided to retreat because they understand they don't need this territory. So the question is what the Russians need on the north of Kiev. And I tried to analyze the entire map of Ukraine, and I found a very important area. To tell the truth, according to my understanding of the situation, I believe that I found one of the most important part of Ukraine, and I'm talking about this area. This part of Ukraine is the most important part in this special operation, and I'll explain to you why. First of all, this is the logistics center, this one, that connects the east part of Ukraine with the west part of Ukraine. I'm not talking about Kiev, and I'm not talking about the same railroad on the north, because let's say let's say indifferently, if the Russians are able to get this on this territory, there are no more railroads that connects the west part of Ukraine with the east part of Ukraine. My bad. There is one road that moves right in front of Transnistria or Pridnestrovia. This is the only road. This is the only one left road after this region. So that means that if the Russians are able, let's say, to create some kind of very short tactical operation without big goals, without significant targets, just one operation to attack Kiev from the north but not enter the Kiev, to get to Kaniv, to this bridgehead, and a small, the same tunnel to the north. So this is the only possible, this is the most necessary movements that the Russians need to achieve. And by this attack, they will be able to completely split Ukraine in two parts. And furthermore, the western part of Ukraine will be completely cut off from the eastern part of Ukraine. And the eastern part of Ukraine won't receive, using tanks, artillery systems, ammo. They won't be able to fix tanks because we know that Ukrainians don't have their local industrial zone to fix and repair the tanks, artillery system. They need to use railroads to move these tanks on the territory of Poland, Romania, and so on. So this is the only thing that the Russians need to achieve. And if they are able to achieve this, in this case, we can say about, we can start counting days before the Ukrainian forces who located in the eastern part of Ukraine will be collapsed. And not because of heavy losses or something like this. They will be completely out of ammo, shells, out of everything. They won't be able to fulfill their ammos, their tanks, and so on. About this operation. The most difficult part in this operation is to cross Dnieper River, of course. But there is one important area in town by the name of Kaniv. There is a dam. It's a railroad dam, as we saw in the town by the name of Nova Kakhovka. As you know, there is the same dam, but that dam is much powerful and bigger and stronger. So if the Russians are able, by some kind of operation, to take control over this area using, paratroopers or something like this, to hold this territory before, meanwhile, the main forces will move from the north to the south. Of course, they can, by this operation, they can completely collapse the Ukrainian forces, and from that very moment, it will be the end of the operation. If we're talking about this bridgehead, we see that the battle line on the west of Kiev is not very big. Just 77 kilometers real front line that the Russians need to control. Because it's not hundreds of kilometers, it's not thousands of kilometers, it's just 77 kilometers on the east of Kiev that the Russians need to protect from the counter-offensive operation that Ukrainians will try to make from the capital of Ukraine. And to tell the truth, 77 kilometers is not a problem to hold. I believe that the Russians are able to hold these 100 or 77 kilometers. And if we're talking about the eastern part of this front line, about this area, during the first months, there are going to be a lot of problems because the Ukrainians will send their forces to this area who will attack in unstoppable mode 24 hours per day this territory just to penetrate, to break through this situation, to encircle the Russians. But if the Russians are able to hold this area for months or maybe even less, at some point of this operation, the Ukrainians on this side of the front line will feel a lack of everything. And at some certain point of time, they just won't have anything to start this offensive operation. So this operation to capture and to hold as long as possible. And of course, the only place where the Ukrainians will be able to attack the Russians is in direction of this bridgehead. And in this case, of course, the Russians, it will be very difficult. But anyway, on the basis of Kherson experience, I understand that the Russians are able to do even this. Furthermore, if we're talking about this river, the Russians will have this dam bridge to supply support. Of course, the Ukrainians will start attacking this dam with hammers, but there is one important problem with this. And the thing is, if the Ukrainians destroy this dam by hammers, as they did in Kherson, entire water from the north between Kiev and Kiev will go to the south, and the towns like Kremenchuk, like Dnipro, like Zaporozhye will completely go underwater. So from this perspective, it is very difficult and it is very dangerous to Ukrainians to destroy this bridge. So it's like some kind of and from the Ukrainians, from the Russians, of course, it's the best solution because they understand that Ukrainians won't be so aggressive against this dam as they used to be in Nova Kakhovka in Kherson district, and at least they will have some guarantees to keep this bridge and to keep this supply and support. And of course, the Russians, furthermore, they will be able to, I believe, to build some pontoon bridges, so they will establish everything they need to cross this river and to supply and support this bridgehead and to hold as long as possible this logistics center. And if we're talking about the south of Ukraine, about this railroad, the only railroad that Ukrainians that will have in this case near Pridnestrovia, I believe that if the Russians see that everything collapses on the territory of Ukraine, I believe that they will take a decision to start offensive operation from Pridnestrovia, and they will cut this railroad as well. And this is going to be like some kind of complete encirclement of very big part of Ukraine that located on the east side of Dnipro and the eastern part of Ukraine. So I understand this is the only reason I understand why the Russians can start. They need to achieve something very big with not very big forces, and they need to do this very fast and very smart and very clever. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds you to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon. Have a good day. Bye bye.